Alright guys, get ready to hear the story of how Native Americans, or Indians as ILL refer to them for the rest of this video, was their preferred term at the time anyway, how they lost pretty much everything, including their lives. It all started when these indigenous tribes who had lived in North America for thousands of years split up into two camps. On one side were the friendly ones who didn't do anything to the Europeans when they arrived and just wanted to be left alone. And then on the other side were the more militant tribes who resisted the Europeans as best they could and tried to fight them off, with weapons that were no match for the muskets of the invaders. The first European to set foot in what would become the United States was an Italian explorer named John Cabot, sailing for the English in 1497. But the first permanent English settlement was unestablished until over a century later in 1620 with Plymouth. So there's a good long while where the only interactions happening between Native Americans and Europeans are sporadic at best. At this point, the only people who regularly crossed the Atlantic were fishermen and men who sailed the seas, stealing from anyone who wasn't part of their own nation. This was especially problematic for the French, since they had several settlements along the Atlantic coast, the oldest being a trading post founded in 1565, which meant they had to constantly be wary of raids by English private. The English also stole fish from the coastal tribes and fought with them over fishing grounds, but nothing too serious. For the most part, it was actually the Dutch who made the biggest impact on the natives at this point with their establishment of New Netherland, which encompassed modern-day New York and the fur trade. The Dutch were the first Europeans to actively try and make allies among the natives and trade with them extensively. They even intermarried with some of them. The Iroquois Confederacy was particularly active in the fur trade and amassed quite a fortune from it. In 1664, however, King Charles II of England granted his brother, the Duke of York, all of the land between the Connecticut River and the Delaware River, which included all of New Netherland, in order to seize the territory. The English sent 1,200 soldiers led by the Duke of York to capture it without firing a single shot. The entire region was handed over to him by the Dutch governor. At this point, the English colonies along the East Coast were still pretty small and sparsely populated. Virginia, which at this point was the largest, only had around 60,000 people, while New England had less than half of that. This meant that the vast majority of the land was still occupied by hundreds of different Native American tribes. Throughout the 17th century, the various colonies continued to push further west into Indian territory. As they did so, they signed treaties with various tribes, most of which were completely ignored by the tribes themselves, who had no intention of sticking to them. The colonists also began to use indentured servitude as a means of labor. At first, many of these servants were Englishmen who had been convicted of crimes, or were simply poor and looking for a better life. But as time went on, more and more Africans were brought over as slaves. As the colonies grew and developed, tensions inevitably rose between the settlers and the natives. The colonists wanted more land for farming and settlements, while the natives wanted to keep as much of their land as possible. To the colonists, the Indians were savages and heathens who needed to be civilized or removed. To the natives, the colonists were just another invasive species like rats or cockroaches who needed to be exterminated. This attitude was summed up perfectly by the leader of the Pequot tribe, Massacre, who said, "We know very well the character of the English nation and their manner of dealing with us Indians. Therefore we cannot expect nor do we desire to live in peace with them." It didn't help that disease ravaged the natives after contact with Europeans, wiping out whole communities. Tensions came to a head in 1636, when an English settler was killed by a Native American. This led to the Pequot War, which resulted in the near-total annihilation of the Pequot tribe and the destruction of their alliance system. The war also demonstrated the ruthlessness of the colonists, who showed no mercy to women or children. By the end of the 17th century, the colonies had grown significantly, with Virginia now having over 250,000 people and Massachusetts having around 100,000. The Carolina colony had also been founded in 1629 and had around 25,000 people. This meant that the colonists were starting to encroach on lands that were claimed by the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, which consisted of 5 different tribes. The Iroquois were far more advanced than any other native tribe, not only because they had more people than the others, but also because they had created a representative government, something that took the colonists centuries to implement. The Iroquois had learned a lot from the Europeans, and had adopted many of their technologies and ideas. Unfortunately for them, though, this wasn't enough to save them from the onslaught of colonists moving into their territory. During this time period, the French and Indian War was fought between Britain and France over control of the Ohio River Valley. The British recruited several Native American tribes to their side, including the Iroquois, while the French recruited others. This would prove to be a costly mistake for the natives though, because once the war was over, the British would turn on them. After the war, Britain realized that the native tribes were an obstacle to their dominance in North America and began to crack down on them. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation was issued, which forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was done to prevent conflicts with the natives, but it also served to limit westward expansion for the colonists. This caused a lot of resentment among the colonists who felt that Britain was oppressing them. In 1770, a group of colonists met at the Albany Congress to discuss their grievances with Britain. One of the main issues they discussed was the Royal Proclamation, which they viewed as a threat to their way of life. They argued that Britain had no right to tell them how to live, and that they should be allowed to move west if they so choose. But, as it turned out, the colonists weren't the only ones upset with Britain at this time. The natives were also feeling the effects of British oppression. For years, the British had been taking advantage of the natives by forcing them to trade with them, stealing their land and breaking their treaties. This had led to a lot of resentment among the natives, who saw the British as nothing more than thieves. In 1774, representatives from several Native American tribes met at the Congress of Tribes to discuss their grievances with the British. Like the colonists, they demanded that the British government allow them to move west of the Appalachians. They also demanded that the British respect their treaties and stop stealing their land. But the British government was not willing to listen to either the colonists or the natives. They cracked down on both groups, arresting leaders and sending troops to put down any dissent. The colonists responded by starting the American Revolution in 1775. The natives watched as the colonists rebelled against the British and saw it as a chance to finally get rid of the British oppression once and for all. At first, the natives were hesitant to join the revolution. They had been burned by the colonists before and were afraid that they would be used again. However, as the war dragged on and the colonists became more successful, the natives began to see that the colonists were serious about fighting the British, so they joined the fray. Unfortunately for the natives, though, the colonists would win the war and go on to take even more of their land. By the early 1800s, most of the natives had been pushed off of their land and forced to live on reservations. Many of them died from diseases brought over by Europeans, while others were simply killed by the colonists. Those who survived eventually assimilated into white society or were killed during the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s. Today, only a few thousand natives remain in the United States, a far cry from the millions that once roamed the land. So yeah, there you have it, guys. That is a very sarcastic and somewhat historically accurate account of how Native Americans lost everything